I am Kelly, and I just wanted to talk about Sandie Peggy because we've had the judgment and it's just unbelievable. I just got, like, after the Supreme Court judgment. Anyway, so I'm gonna be using an article from the Times to talk about this. So I'm just gonna read what was in the Times. So Sandie Peggy versus NHS Fife and Dr. Upton. In public, at least, her supporters claimed victory. Sandie Peggy had, after all, been found to have been harassed by her employer, NHS Fife, in 4 different ways. But the veteran nurse's win was a relatively narrow one. It was far from the slam dunk that gender-critical campaigners had hoped for and had, in truth, expected after their landmark Supreme Court win in April. Absolutely. You know, the Supreme Court judgment was clear. I can't believe we're here. Anyway, to go on. A load of sexist shite was how one leading activist privately described the 312-page ruling. I don't think the judge would fall for his, i.e. Beth Upton's, shtick. I was wrong. It never ceases to amaze me how insane this thing is. It really is. You have to laugh, otherwise you'd cry. It means an employment tribunal, which has divided opinion for the best part of a year, is unlikely to be the end of the case. An appeal, well-informed sources said, is now a near certainty. Absolutely. I hope she does go to appeal. She hasn't said either way yet, I don't think. The Dundee Employment Tribunal upheld 4 of Peggy's claims against NHS Fife. It found that the Health Board had harassed Peggy, including by failing to revoke Upton's permissions to use female changing rooms on an interim basis after the nurse complained, and had taken an unreasonable amount of time to investigate the issue. But it dismissed other allegations against NHS Fife and the entirety of the case against Upton. Amongst the most contentious findings was that it is potentially but not necessarily lawful to still allow trans women, i.e. biological men who identify as women, to use female-only spaces in the workplace. The tribunal suggested that rather than a blanket ban on trans women in female spaces, permitting access would become unlawful only if a woman complained. What? Even then, various factors such as the trans woman's efforts to appear feminine would have to be balanced when deciding whose rights took precedence. Quite frankly, I don't give a shit. I really don't care how feminine a man looks. He's still a man. The Supreme Court ruling won in April by the campaign group For Women Scotland has been praised as a model of clarity. The Equality and Human Rights Commission appears to agree. Its updated code of practice, leaked to the Times, states unambiguously that access to single-sex spaces must be based on biological sex. However, the Code of Practice submitted to the UK government for approval 3 months ago, intended to assist bodies such as the NHS in interpreting cases like the Peggy dispute, is yet to see the light of day. It remains unpublished. The Equalities Minister, Bridget Phillipson, insisting it must be thoroughly and carefully considered. At the weekend, Baroness Falconer of Margravine, the chairwoman of the AHRC, when it was submitted, urged Phillipson to get a move on and suggested the real reason for the delay was fears of a backlash from pro-trans Labour MPs. This ruling just shows the reason we need the guidance from Westminster to be published urgently. Tina Budge, a director of For Women Scotland, said, she noted that the Supreme Court ruling stated that provisions required for the protection of women necessarily exclude men. obviously, yet this appeared not to have been considered. Unfortunately, this judgment is all over the place and in parts littered with nonsense and the language of trans activism. It actually absolutely is. That putting on makeup and wearing a dress is what defines a woman. The short row between Peggy and Upton in changing rooms at Victoria Hospital, Kirkcaldy, 2 years ago this month would go on to cause one of the most consequential employment tribunals in British legal history. On Christmas Eve 2023, the nurse, who was 50 at the time, encountered Upton, then 28, in the women's facilities. The nurse, who said she had been sexually assaulted in her youth and at the time was suffering a heavy period, said Upton had no right to be there. Within hours, Upton had complained of being subjected to a transphobic hate incident, leading to Peggy being suspended and threatened with the sack. To her supporters, Peggy has been held up as a working-class hero who refused to play along with the fiction that her middle-class colleague was a woman. To her critics, she was an unreformed bigot who joked about floods in Pakistan. I've got no idea why that's relevant. Like, what has a joke outside of work got to do with this? Absolutely sod all. Upton, meanwhile, was lauded by LGBT campaigners as someone who had devoted a career to helping others, only to be forced into becoming a lightning rod for the culture wars. Just a doctor trying to do her job and support her patients was how Ross Greer, the Scottish Greens co-leader, described Upton. She has been dragged through this horrendous invasive process for no good reason. Critics, however, saw an arrogant and vindictive doctor intent on ruining the career of a woman who dared to raise a challenge. The judgment was clear which evidence of the two protagonists the tribunal preferred. The claimant, Sandie Peggy, gave evidence that in some particular respects we did not consider to be credible, the ruling said. The nurse's justification of highly offensive comments about victims of floods in Pakistan as dark humour was an untruthful attempt to downplay what she had done. Why is it relevant? It's not relevant? I can't believe they accepted that as evidence. Meanwhile, her claim not to know Isla Bryson, the sex offender initially placed in a female jail was a rapist, when she raised the women's prison incident with Upton, was deemed not credible. Peggy, the tribunal said, had also made remarks that could be described as transphobic. Well, that's a big red flag. The very fact that the tribunal said that someone was transphobic that's using the language of the cult. So this ruling is not. It's not sound, is it? Upton, meanwhile, was seen as a credible and broadly a reliable witness to the panel. How? He's a man who's pretending to be a woman. How does that make him reliable? Like, the first time he did that, that makes him a liar? While aspects of the doctor's evidence, such as the time at which notes were created detailing Peggy's prior behaviour, were later shown to be not accurate. The tribunal considered that Upton had not been lying, instead making honest mistakes. It was inaccurate in part, but in our view, honestly so, the judges said. They also dismissed the suggestion that accusations made by Upton against Peggy regarding 2 patient safety incidents were motivated by malice. Maya Forstater, chief executive of the gender-critical charity Sex Matters, who won her own landmark employment tribunal case on appeal in 2021, said there were wins for Sandie in the judgment, with her case succeeding on 4 separate grounds. However, she said she worried about the wider implications of the ruling. On questions about whether Upton should have been in the changing rooms in the first place, we think the law has been wrongly applied and we hope Sandie will appeal, she said. No shit. There seems to have been a burn the witch approach, in which Sandie is censured for complaining too loudly. In another recent case, Maria Kelly, who lost a tribunal on broadly similar issues, apparently didn't complain loudly enough. It's always the fault of the woman, isn't it? The danger is that we've already seen misinformation about the Supreme Court ruling, and these cases, while likely to succeed on appeal, will muddy the waters further, and I can see evidence of that on LinkedIn. Honestly, the TRAs are going wild about this because they think that it's right, and it's clearly not. That is going to be harmful until they can be overturned. Yes, it's going to be harmful until they overturn and the appeal comes through. For its part, NHS Fife, which has spent well over £320,000 of public money on the case, how on earth is that justified to spend public money on this? This is unreal. It's outrageous. It's unbelievable. Like, our taxes are being spent on this to decide whether men should be allowed in women's changing rooms. The answer's no, they shouldn't. NHS Fife, which has spent well over £320,000 of public money on the case, hinted that it was desperate to move on. I bet you are, after being humiliated in the court. Its focus would be to support staff to deliver health and care to the population of Fife, a spokeswoman said. Are you sure she was a woman? But as much as the health board management might hope otherwise, it appears that they have not yet heard the last of Sandie Peggy. Thank goodness. I hope she sues their arses off. Honestly, this is so infuriating. I don't know what you think about it. Watching this and listening to the responses that we're seeing on the internet, but it's just, it beggars belief after the Supreme Court judgment. I mean, we didn't even need that, really. Like, everybody knows what a man is and everybody knows what a woman is, and if you're pretending, then you're in the wrong. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking about it now because it's rage-inducing, isn't it? And I have heard from some women who have heard about the results who are also outraged and upset that this is the outcome after all that time. And they've produced 312 pages of absolute twaddle. How on earth can you take that long and write that amount of drivel? Like, just keep it simple. There's men and there's women, and men shouldn't be in women's spaces.